An inside look into the NCAA and House settlement.
Litigation, settlements, and governance are always in the news, so we're back on the Big Mountain.
Hey, welcome back to the Big Mountain. I am JY, and this is my good friend Steve. And we are bringing on a very special guest, one of the most trusted reporters that Steve and I follow, Amanda Christovich. She is the sports business reporter with Front Office Sports, and we're going to talk about the fallout from the House settlement and also what may be happening with congressional action. So here's our discussion with Amanda. Amanda, welcome to the Big Mountain. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we really appreciate you giving us some of your time. I know you've been very busy, obviously, with work. I think you also had a vacation here recently as well, went to Europe. So how are things overall for you?
Yeah, things are good. I did get to sneak in a quick trip to Europe. I did think that the House settlement would be decided long before the trip was planned at the end of May, but you know what? It's the settlement didn't get approved until June 6th. June 6th, yeah. So everything's fine. Just got back from NACDA, which was, as you can imagine, there was nothing to talk about, nothing, nothing new going on. Kind of a whirlwind of a few days down in Orlando. But it kind of seems like everybody has been breathing a sigh of relief that this settlement has gotten passed, and now we can move forward.
A huge step in collegiate athletics. I mean, you've been talking and writing about the settlement, congressional action, all this stuff. You're the sports business writer, so you're deep into this, and that's why Steve and I really appreciate your writings. And I'd love to talk to you about kind of all that stuff. Let's start with NACTA. I mean, you said you were just down there. Gotta love going to Orlando in the summer. No better place to be in that
Yeah.
hot, humid area, but. Kind of overall, can you give us just a vibe of how you felt the convention went? Like, what was maybe just the main feeling, the main takeaways of what went on there at the beginning of last week?
I definitely feel like there was less panic than maybe a lot of us were anticipating, because obviously the House settlement, gets its final stamp of approval on June 6th, which is less than a month before revenue sharing is supposed to begin. And so maybe I think a lot of us wondered if there might be some, a lot of stress. And for the most part, all of the administrators that I spoke with, they certainly had their gripes with the settlement and their frustrations and concerns with the implementation of it. There was definitely a lot of frustration with, I would say, power conference administrators who have had a direct line to all the information, whereas, everyone else can be part of the settlement, but since they're not defending conferences, they weren't getting the first line of communication on how the rules were going to work. So there was definitely a little of anxiety and frustration there. But overall, I do feel like everyone sort of showed up with a sigh, like after having breathed a sigh of relief. Everyone came on a Sunday, and the settlement had been decided 2 days before then. So I even talked to some folks, at the hotel bar, which was overflowing, of course. And they were kind of like, well, we saw it got approved. We took a deep breath and we're like, all right, we're going to read through everything on Monday. So, and I can't blame them.
For sure. Were you surprised at the time? I mean, it's a judge, federal judge, they'll do whatever they want. I was a little surprised it came out late on Friday. Was that surprising to you? Somebody that follows this type of thing?
It wasn't surprising that it came out on a Friday, but I definitely was surprised that it got entered into the docket at 9 p.m. Eastern. I'm in New York City, and normally, on these days that I've been waiting for a decision, it's after 8 p.m., I kind of slam my laptop shut because, the business hours, especially in the legal world in courts, are 5 p.m. So it was a bit strange, but I guess Judge Wilkin just said, let's take this extra hour and get it done, because, the rest of us have to read it, report on it, talk about it, obsess over it. But for Judge Wilkin, once she hit submit, that was her weekend. That got to start at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. So it was it wasn't that surprising, but it certainly was a little bit frustrating. It could have happened at 4 p.m. That would have been a little bit nicer, but you know what? That's the job.
That's a great point. We look at it from people that are covering this as, my gosh, a huge, very important information happened at a 9 p.m. on a Friday, whereas the judge is saying, hey, I'm done. This is great. I got
Yeah.
it done before the weekend. I don't have to think about it anymore. So, it's kind of the other side of the coin there. No doubt about that. And it's interesting, you mentioned kind of a sigh of relief and like, we don't have this hanging over our head, this unknown and all of this. It's funny because I spoke with Utah Valley's AD Sumption here last week. Obviously, Utah Valley not a part of the P4. That's kind of where I want to get to here. Kind of that maybe a little discontent between some parties here. He mentioned that he felt there was kind of a lot of confusion, limited
Hmm.
guidance. I want to get to the kind of the Q&A here later on, but at least at the time, early last week, just limited guidance. Yes, they knew there was a settlement, but he really said he felt like there was confusion. I know you mentioned in an article last week that the P4 administrators were kind of trumpeting this as a major solution. I believe Ohio State AD Bjork just said he quoted just saying like it's not that complicated, like it is what it is.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. Again, that's an AD within the P4 that's been a part of, I'm sure, talks at the conference level that is a defendant in this settlement. But there's a lot of leaders, the majority of ADs that are not in the Power Four here that are confused. At least they were before maybe this Q&A came out. And maybe skeptical about the rules and their stability and their enforceability and all this stuff that all of us have kind of been questioning. So can you speak to maybe that difference? And you hit on that early on, the difference maybe between ADs, the discontent with them, and even the conference leaders. Like, where do you think things are really at right now?
I think, look, even amongst the P4, I think that there is skepticism, specifically with the NIL clearinghouse and whether or not it's going to prevent, quote, pay for play deals. You know, whether or not pay for play can be prevented at all. That's kind of what we're doing now with revenue sharing, right? And even if you provide a valid business purpose to an NIL deal, who's to say that it isn't still somehow pay for play, right? It's just pay for play plus autograph signing or plus, social media campaign. Um, so there's definitely a lot of skepticism, but there's, I think, fewer questions coming from those power conference administrators about, the nuts and bolts of the implementation process. I think mostly like the basic terms of the settlement have been available publicly for several months. So I think most athletic directors in D1 have sort of said, okay, based on the information we have, that's probably enough to decide whether or not we're going to opt in, at least this year. Although, I did hear from others at NACDA that like there were still some decisions to be made. But I think the biggest questions were about implementation. And if you work in compliance, for example, and you are going to be looking at a completely new rule book, there's a lot of minutia that may not be making headlines that you have questions about. And all of those details just weren't really being communicated, in part because they hadn't been decided yet. So a week ago from when we're recording this, I asked the power conference commissioners what punishments they've decided to dole out if athletes violate the terms of the clearinghouse or schools, try to go above the rev share cap, etc. And they sort of were like, oh, well, we're going to figure that out. And I'm like, well, the settlement happened 3 days ago and you've already rolled out the enforcement entity, but the enforcement entity hasn't decided what punishments, like, wouldn't you want to publicize that? I mean, look, I don't know. I've never run an enforcement entity, so don't ask me. But
Right.
some of the answers to those questions, like, literally don't exist. And yes, there was an FAQ that was put out this past Friday to give a few more details. But I think a lot of these non-power conference administrators are just going, I'm in my athletic department trying to figure out how we're going to do this, right? Like, who enters things into the clearinghouse? Are we going to get in trouble if our athletes don't? Do we have to enter? Things like of that nature, that they just, kind of weren't in the loop on.
Well, to follow up on that, Amanda, do you think this is a case of because you kind of mentioned this, the P4 and including the P5, including the PAC, because they were defendants. Do you think this
Yeah.
is a case of where the defendants are just more in the loop because they were named defendants, they were involved in the negotiation, or do you think could this be just another one of those kind of disconnects between the haves and the have-nots, where the power conferences, the rich conferences are figuring out, ooh, how can we use this? We're going to have this new revenue share. How can we use this to move forward? Whereas the non P4 are looking at it as like, how do we survive this? I don't have 25 people in my athletic department that can report this stuff. How do I survive the nuts and bolts? So do you think it's systemic, or just a part of some people were included in the negotiations and some were not?
I definitely think it's who's included in the negotiations. I mean, look, when you have these big settlements, you often don't want to bring in other parties. I mean, there was criticism. If you remember the NCAA as like the entity, the NCAA was criticized for not bringing in the rest of Division One when they made the decision to cut some of the annual distributions in order to pay for the settlement. But that's like that's kind of par for the course in the sense of like, if you're not one of the defendants, then like you're probably not going to be in that room. But what I do think is interesting is that as a result of that, the power conferences decided to create an enforcement entity that they were running. Like, they didn't have to take on the responsibility of creating a new enforcement entity for college sports compensation, and therefore take on the responsibility of implementing that entity and giving out information to the rest of D1. Like, nobody, that was like terms of the settlement that they agreed to. That I don't know whose idea it was. I wasn't in the room, unfortunately. Wish I was. But like, they didn't have to do that. So I think it's interesting that they have taken on this responsibility for all of Division One, and now they are going to not be able to point the finger at the NCAA. The finger is going to be pointed at them when there are criticisms. And already we're seeing that finger pointed. I don't think it's intentional that the power conferences didn't give out their FAQ. I guess lawyers had to review it. There was like a legal issue there, but ultimately what ended up happening was a vacuum of information. And so they're the ones who are going to get blamed because they gave themselves the responsibility of running this new enforcement. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I do think it's like interesting that they've decided to put themselves in this position.
Be careful what you wish for. You may just get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you mentioned the FAQ a couple of times, and that came out on Friday here. I know you did a couple tweets on that. Roster limits. One of the sticky wickets here, kind of waiting on a settlement, whether or not it was going to happen or not. Really, was this roster limits grandfathering? I believe 10 of the 36 pages, give or take, are on roster limits. They talk about a lot of other things, buyouts, how they might work, and the types of benefits and all this. Was there anything, as you looked at them, any major surprises coming out of this Q&A document, or just kind of filling in gaps that we didn't have before?
So there were two things that I found to be particularly interesting. Well, maybe three. I just found it was interesting that the way that the roster limits is going to be counted is through that same software that's counting the revenue sharing cap, because I was thinking, like, how are they going to adjudicate that and enforce it? Anyway, so I found that to be somewhat interesting. I didn't know that every single athlete in Division One, regardless of whether or not your school opts into the settlement, is required to submit all of your NIL deals to NIL Go, to the clearinghouse. And that, obviously the ones that aren't related to boosters or collectives theoretically won't really be scrutinized, but you are still supposed to do that no matter what school you're at or what decision that school or conference has made. I hadn't really seen a ton of clarity about what the athletes at schools who didn't opt in, what their obligations were for this clearinghouse. I have no idea how that is going to be enforced, because this is now a rule that's being run by the conferences. So maybe they'll write it into the NCAA bylaws. But if you're not an athlete that's like not at a school that opts in, why would you, for any reason, need to use this clearinghouse? I don't know. I think there's some legal issues there. That doesn't mean that that information wasn't available. It just means I hadn't seen it.
Yeah.
But I could tell you that even if the information is available, if I haven't seen it, there's a chance that a lot of other people haven't either. So that was a big surprise. And then the other big surprise was about buyouts, which I just filed a story or published a story on like an hour ago.
Okay.
Because I got to dig into it a little bit. But the interesting thing about revenue sharing buyouts is that not only does the school the athlete transfers to have to pay the buyout, but that money counts towards your revenue sharing cap. And it was pointed out to me by some of the Twitter lawyers that there was a rule in the NFL that free agents, if a free agent jumped from one team to another, the team A usually had to pay team B some sort of, team B had to pay team A some sort of fee in addition, like almost like a penalty.
Mhm.
And that rule was found to be illegal under antitrust because it restricted trade, quote unquote, or restricted player movement. And there's some folks are saying, well, this, revenue sharing cap thing that could be put in the same category in court. So somebody going to challenge the concept of a buyout. Obviously, we don't know how many of these buyouts are being written into these contracts because it sounds to me like it's not really relevant to especially a lot of schools that are only signing like 1 semester or 1 year contracts anyway. But I did find it interesting. The NCAA and the power conferences didn't have to put that in the FAQ, but they did. So here we are.
I feel like maybe the FAQ is going to create a lot more FAQ. But hey,
Yes.
we got to start somewhere, right? So at least
Well, and can I just say what was particularly interesting to me was at NACDA, there were a couple folks in the power conference administrator side, and I believe an NCAA administrator who said that the FAQ was 51 pages.
Yes.
And the one we have is 36. So, and the lawyers had to go through the FAQ before they published it. So the conspiracy theorist in me is sitting here wondering what happened to those other pages and what was on them.
And 15 pages is a lot
Yeah.
for lawyers to redact.
Well, I think it was Pat Chun because I was just doing some reading here before we had Amanda on, and I don't mean to name drop, but I'm pretty sure one of the ones that I saw name 51 pages was Pat Chun, and I saw that. I appreciate you bringing that up because I'm thinking, man, 51 to 36,
Big difference.
yeah, a couple of pages here or there is one thing, but 15 pages is pretty significant. So we'll see what that means, if it means anything, but. Let's last talk about congressional action. Kind of at this point, now that we have a settlement, we talk about a three-legged stool here on the channel, the settlement being one of potentially 3 legs that are needed for a kind of new reality. And I kind of went back in time. I saw an article that you wrote here about a year ago. I believe it was May of last year. It was called A Breathtaking, let me get this right, A Breathtaking Lobbying Campaign, the NCAA's sophisticated effort to save amateurism. So I want to preface my question with some of what you put in that to see where you're at today from where you are maybe about a year ago when you wrote that. At the end of that article, you said that the House settlement was being presented as this pinnacle of, the golden age of athletes, and that the NCAA hoped that Congress would see this settlement as some sort of goodwill, kind of moving forward to then help pass a law to stop them from having to make more radical changes. Like, hey, we did this settlement, we've done a whole lot, we're trying hard, but we need your help to kind of get there. Here we are a year later. We have an approved settlement. We know what it is. We just talked about some of that, the significant changes going on right now. Do you believe that Congress, has seen the goodwill, as you kind of wrote before? That's question number one. And do you think they're really willing to act on a law to kind of, help prop up this stool, as I started off with? And if they are, how close do you think any sort of action might be? So that's a loaded question there. But I'd love to hear your first thoughts on what you wrote a year ago and kind of where we are today.
Yeah. Look, I think the NCAA and the power conferences are very much still using that same playbook. Now more than ever, between January and March, in the lead up to the decision about the settlement being approved, I actually did, a very small follow up on that story because the NCAA doubled or more than doubled, if I remember correctly, somewhere around doubled their lobbying expenditures. So just between January and March from what they were doing before, which was already, as you quoted, breathtaking. I think that they are still expecting Congress or hoping that Congress will see the House settlement as this, checklist of things that they have done that Congress has asked them to do, more benefits to offer athletes, so that, as you said, Congress will come in and save the rest. I still think that that is what their playbook is. I'm not sure how successful it's going to be. I know that they're making this blitz on Capitol Hill continuously to get a bill that gives them back the power to, stop athletes from being employees, to prevent collective bargaining, to get all these state laws thrown out and basically give themselves power to put compensation rules back on the table that can't be challenged in court with an antitrust exemption or some sort of protection. Like, they're still asking for all those things. To your question about whether or not Congress is motivated, I think a lot of Republicans are motivated because it's for the it's very strange, at least to me, as sort of like a layman political observer, that Republicans are interested in capping a free market. That's usually not a conservative principle, but a lot of Republicans have sort of taken the NCAA side here and the power conference's side. Democrats are less motivated and interested in doing anything, either because they don't know, they don't care, or they're sort of more pro-labor, pro-collective bargaining position. The best way to achieve that is to stall, to do nothing, to allow, a new administration to come in with maybe a more liberal NLRB and to just let any court cases about athlete employment play out, etc. So that's kind of like the lay of the land. But even within the Republican Party, there's not a consensus. And we still don't know what President Trump thinks. So it's not like there's a bellwether in the party of what they really want to do. And it was brought to my attention that whether you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, if Trump takes a position on something, it becomes a partisan topic because all Democrats will most likely knee-jerk reaction oppose whatever he wants to do. That may not end up being the case once the dust has settled, but in Congress, that tends to be the theme, right? So if President Trump comes out in favor of certain pro-NCAA policies, it's very possible that could actually be a bad thing for the NCAA, because even though, do you guys remember that, like, When a Bill Becomes a Law song?
Oh, yeah. I share that to JY all the time on Twitter.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah, Schoolhouse Rock.
So one thing that I'm constantly reminded is that you're going to need 60 votes in the Senate for a bill that has to do with curbing athlete compensation because of the filibuster. So you are going to need Democrats on board as well as all Republicans, even if the House of Representatives, which is majority Republican, can get something passed quickly. Obviously, there are some other things happening in the world, which is the other thing I wanted to point out. Yeah. That, there are a lot of offices that really enjoy holding hearings about college sports and getting sort of sound bites into the ether, and pleasing their university presidents and their constituencies. But they're not super motivated to get anything done because they kind of have other things to worry about. And regardless of, various geopolitical situations, which is what's sort of coming to mind for me right now, like the Senate is still kind of in this deadlock of the reconciliation bill. So I really don't see anything happening anytime soon. And in a weird world where there is time and space to legislate on college sports, I still don't see any sort of consensus emerging, even within the parties, let alone, the two of them together.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a couple follow-ups to that.
Okay.
First of all, I know you're a little younger than us. I'm not going to ask you your age, but I love the fact that you are plugged in with Schoolhouse Rock,
That's right.
How a Bill Becomes a Law.
Yes.
Every American
It was still
child-
played when I was in school.
Exactly.
So
I love it.
I don't know.
I'm so happy to hear
Okay.
that. And the other thing I want to say, I want to go back to your article from last May. JY and I think we'd been following you a little bit before that. You were covering some of the litigation and stuff. But to me, I would really think that article is what put you on the national map, the national landscape as a top college sports business reporter.
Thank you.
I don't know what the criteria is for Pulitzer and all that. I hope somebody no, I'm serious. I hope somebody, your editors or whoever, put you in for that or nominate, because it was amazing the way you peeled that back. It was very comprehensive. And me, as someone, I feel like I'm very plugged in with college sports and the money involved and governmental issues. It was eye-opening to me the way you laid it out there, how much money has been spent, and they've been pretty effective in turning the narrative, at least. Maybe not legislation yet, but changing the narrative, because we had 4 or 5 years, or maybe 20 years, depending on how you look at it, of players getting more rights, more rights, more rights. And as you showed, the schools and the NCAA, they really put forth a major lobbying campaign to slow that momentum. So just want to throw out there, I really thought it was groundbreaking. And I'm serious I hope they put you in for a Pulitzer for that thing, because I thought it was great. And I really thought, again, that put you on the national landscape. But my question, an actual follow-up question is, you said you didn't think anything will get done anytime soon. So when you were at, it's NACDA, right? The AD. When you were there, you brought up some antitrust issues. I've been pessimistic about this settlement, not necessarily that it wouldn't get done, but that it was just going to open Pandora's box, because to me, it's still like Brett Kavanaugh, I like beers, said the NCAA was a walking antitrust violation. I think
Yep.
a lot of the things in this settlement are blatant antitrust violations. So, do you get any sense that the schools, the people involved in this, that they're either panicked or very motivated to work with Congress to get that antitrust protection? Because if not, this whole settlement could be blown up within the next year or two, anyways. And we're starting. So, I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it depends like what school you're at and you know, how your athletic director or your university president leans, because a lot of these, the campaigns are being spearheaded by the NCAA and the power conferences, but obviously, there are athletic directors who are going to Capitol Hill, on to represent their conferences and sort of trumpet these talking points, right? But again, I really think it depends. I imagine not everybody is on board. And I don't even have to say I imagine, because I know for a fact and publicly, remember when Tennessee's athletic director a couple weeks ago published a video saying that he thought collective bargaining was the answer, and the person interviewing him was the school's university president, and she was nodding her head and agreeing with him and saying, that's the only solution, right? So just because the SEC is lobbying for, this antitrust protection and this sort of, I don't know if you would call it I want to say it's almost like a new carve out in the American economy of like how a labor market looks, and how the free market looks, because it doesn't exist anywhere else, this exemption without collective bargaining. Anyway, so I think it depends on the school, short answer to your question. But there are definitely administrators, Ohio State's athletic director Ross Bjork is one of them, who has been on Capitol Hill, clearly very involved in this effort. And it really just depends on which schools are going to be willing to come out against their conferences and say, actually, we don't really agree with this congressional playbook and what you guys are asking for. So we'll have to see. I'm waiting for someone to invite Danny White to be on one of these committees. but I don't think he's one of the top choices for the NCAA lobbyists for their list of witnesses. Let's just put it that
too
way.
outspoken.
Well, Amanda Christovich, sports business reporter with Front Office Sports. You are one of the best, as Steve said. We appreciate everything that you do. We follow you very, very closely. Thank you for your time here on the Big Mountain.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Again, we thank Amanda for coming on the Big Mountain. That was a great discussion. Steve, what were your takeaways?
Yeah, again, just like I said, Amanda's great. We've been both following her for about the last year or so on Twitter X. She's done fantastic work. Just very diligent reporter, and she really goes deep into the details. This time she was able to give us kind of an inside look on how they're actually going to be implementing this House settlement. So I thought that was great. Again, she just does a great job. So I'm glad she was able to take some time on here. I don't know if there was anything really surprising, although it was kind of cool to hear her give her what surprised her about the House settlement, because she's so into this, so we finally get the Q&A that comes out. She gave us some items that she was surprised on, and I just thought it was a great interview.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to hear what she had to say, because I've been hearing some different things about what came out of NACDA, and whether it was a lot of good information, confusion, as I mentioned. And it was good to hear her take. Again, somebody that was there, she could hear from different ADs in terms of what they actually got out of it. So I really appreciated that. Of course, we talked about that FAQ, going from 51 down to 36 or whatever it was pages. Very interesting. I appreciated some of her thoughts, some of her main takeaways from that. And I know she does, had posted some of that on X as well, but some really good, interesting things there. And then, of course, I had to ask her about, that article that she had done about a year ago, kind of where that she was at then and where we are today. And has really anything changed? I mean, yeah, we have the House settlement, but still a ton of unknowns, a ton of potential litigation, and we got a long way to go, I think.
Well, we had Ross Dellinger on before. We asked him about the litigation.
Yeah.
And I definitely, or not the litigation, the congressional action,
right,
the hearings and all that. And it sounded like over time he got more pessimistic. Amanda was also a little bit more pessimistic about if we get any congressional action. And, we try and stay away from politics, but she brought up there's a lot of other things that's taking up attention, in D.C. right now. And so she brought up some of the barriers there. I'm hopeful. We've had some other people on to say they think it could happen real fast.
Yeah.
I hope that's the case. But if not, you get the impression, especially for her, she's so plugged into it, that the longer this drags out, the less likely there is some kind of congressional action, which I still think puts this settlement in a lot of jeopardy. We could be at a point a year from now, 18 months from now, where this whole settlement is thrown out, except for the part where they get to revenue share. But maybe all of the other limitations or restrictions are thrown out for antitrust reasons, anti-competitive reasons, whatever, which is a total different thing than what they were trying to get. So again, she just a great job by Amanda. She really brought up some great points.
Make sure you follow her on X. We mentioned that three-legged stool, of course, the settlement being one. Yep. The next one that probably will happen here next week is the governance. We'll see what happens there. But that congressional piece, you need three legs of your stool to stand, and that is going to be the hardest one to get.
Who would ever thought D.C. would be the shaky leg in that stool that might topple it all over?
Shocking, I'm sure, yes. So, hey, we thank you guys for watching this. And again, we thank Amanda. Fantastic discussion with her. Smack the like button. Make sure you subscribe if you like our content. A lot more interviews yet to come here in 2025 as we gear up for the football season. Only 2 months away. We're getting excited. So, hey, we thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Big Mountain.